We continue to be led by alarmist politicians making it up as they go along. Thankfully, the public are waking up. Robin says, quote, "The reason Andrews is keen to keep covered numbers in the forefront of the news is because it keeps branch stacking, red shirts and quarantine off the front page. Many of you are complaining about Daniel Andrews sending best wishes to the families of the deceased. As you rightly say, he should be relaying condolences. But let me begin by making the point about whether or not the Defence Force offered assistance to Victoria to help secure quarantine hotels. On this and on many other things, Daniel Andrews is completely out of his depth. He told the Victorian Parliament's Public Accounts and Estimates Committee that, quote, "I don't believe ADF support was on offer." That was what prompted Defence Minister Linda Reynolds to say that the Prime Minister had made an offer to all states on March 27. But here is a metaphor of Andrews' ignorance. Under Section 119 of the Constitution, the state has to expressly invite the Commonwealth to participate in the securing of the state. The Commonwealth, and especially the Australian Defence Force, can't invite itself into a state activity. That ADF officers and personnel were involved with state efforts shows that the Andrews government knew and invited the Commonwealth in. Why the Morrison government have not made more of this dishonesty, I do not know. Defence would have kept every single record of every contact between the Victorian government, especially a Premier, and the Minister and the military brass for planning purposes. This stuff is kept in chronological form and in enormous volume. Plainly, Mr Andrews is not only fiddling with the truth, but he's also stupid, too stupid, I would say, to be in charge of a state. I mentioned before that it matters little to these leaders that the well-being of children is being sacrificed. Year 12 students look forward to a school formal. In the totalitarian world we inhabit now, they have been banned. No debate, no parliamentary endorsement, just a fiat, just a directive. And what's more, boys, especially in relation to sport, and girls, find representing at the highest level the pinnacle of school excitement. GPS rugby's now been suspended, which most probably means cancelled, when these young people have been looking forward to representing their school at the highest level all their lives. Now it's taken away. A health officer has said there'll be new rules for school sport, new bans on regional and state competition to stop people from mixing together. So in New South Wales, all sporting activities have been called off overnight. Well done, Gladys. Netball state titles way down. In late September, they've been called off, and the girls have been training for months. And they now have to sit an HSC with all this emotional trauma of disappointment. This borders, in my view, on criminal damage to the well-being of young people. All awards ceremonies, all dinners banned. And to give you a measure of the stupidity and ad hocery, we're told that guidelines for spectators have been tightened up. Spectators? Haven't these dopes called off all sporting activity? What is there to see? All school sport in New South Wales cancelled immediately. This is totalitarian madness with no scientific basis. There are 630 Australians in hospital, 620 in Victoria, 10 in the rest of Australia. 52 Australians in intensive care out of 25 million, 45 in Victoria, 7 in the rest of Australia. But from today in New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian has banned group singing and wind instruments from schools. Nothing to justify it. You can go to a wedding, but you can't shake hands, kiss, sing, dance or stand up. What kind of country have we become? Put the scientific evidence into the public place, which justifies all of this. But remember, Gladys Berejiklian says, no one will lose their jobs as a result of the Ruby Princess debacle because we need continuity of service during the pandemic. Well, Gladys, it's not a pandemic. That's the first point. And we don't need continuity of service from people who are incompetent. And that includes the 4 members of the so-called New South Wales Health Expert Panel who are found to have committed serious and inexcusable failures. But to the COVID bedwetters, none of this matters. As I asked last night, are we too frightened or too brainwashed to defend our freedoms? Are we satisfied with evasiveness from politicians, with chief health officers running the country, with being given no scientific justification for what we're being told to do? Politicians are elected and paid to serve the public, not to wield power without responsibility. Thankfully, sections of the media are at long last waking up. because up until now, they just broadcast what these so-called health experts have told them. So where are we today? Well, as an excellent editorial said in the Australian newspaper, we now face disturbing trends that go to the heart of our system of government. Our Constitution sets out key provisions of how the nation is to function. So if the Constitution is irrelevant, if all our freedoms can be just stolen from us and borders can be locked down in total defiance of Section 92, when was the Constitution ripped up and on whose authority? Where is the legal advice that justifies this? Why hasn't the Federal Parliament sat or the Legislative Assembly in Victoria? Is it, as George Orwell said, that, quote, no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it? There's one final point I must make. What is the scientific basis for all of this? Well, late last night, I read a scientific paper called, quote, How a Free Society Deals with Pandemics, according to the legendary epidemiologist and smallpox eradicator, Professor Donald Henderson. The paper was peer-reviewed and co-authored. Professor Henderson was the 20th century's most acclaimed disease eradicator, credited with ridding the world of smallpox, a far more contagious disease than this bad flu. In part, Professor Henderson's team wrote, in relation to responses to so-called pandemics, I quote, travel restrictions, such as closing airports and screening travellers at borders, have historically been ineffective. Screening and quarantining entering travellers at international borders did not substantially delay virus introduction. In past pandemics, and will likely be less effective in the modern era, screening individuals on domestic interstate flights for symptoms of flu would not be effective during seasonal influenza epidemics. He said, public events with an expected large attendance have sometimes been cancelled or postponed, the rationale being to decrease the number of contacts with those who might be contagious. There are, however, no certain indications that these actions have had any definitive effect on the severity or duration of an epidemic. A policy calling for community-wide cancellation of public events is inadvisable. Cancelling or postponing large meetings, he said, would not be likely to have any significant effect on the development of the epidemic. He said a policy directing community closure of public events is inadvisable. He said there's no basis for recommending quarantine, either of groups or individuals. Experience has shown that communities faced with epidemics or other adverse events respond best and with the least anxiety when the normal social functioning of the community is least disrupted. Unquote. So, which experts have our so-called leaders been listening to? The actions we have taken are almost polar opposite of those recommended by Professor Donald Henderson, the 20th century's most acclaimed disease eradicator. And what price are we paying?